They told you the Wild West was about brave cowboys and honorable lawmen. That's a lie. What really happened out there was so dark, so twisted, so completely insane that historians spent over a century burying it. The truth about the Old West would destroy every myth you've ever believed. Today, you're getting 23 forbidden secrets that powerful people tried to erase from history. No sugarcoating, no Hollywood fantasy, just raw documented facts that'll make you question everything. Stay with me until the end because number 23 will blow your mind. Let's go. Number 1, Wyatt Earp was a pimp and a thief before he became a lawman. Everyone knows Wyatt Earp as the legendary marshal who cleaned up Tombstone and survived the OK Corral shootout. The movies made him a symbol of frontier justice, a man who stood for law and order against chaos. The shining star of westerns for over a century. But before Earp wore a badge, he was running brothels, stealing horses, and jumping bail to avoid prison time. This isn't speculation or rumor. This is documented history that Hollywood deliberately buried. In 1870, Wyatt married his first wife, Urilla Sutherland, in Missouri. She died shortly after their marriage, possibly from typhoid fever, and some historians believe she may have been pregnant when she died. Earp didn't grieve for long. Within months, he was arrested in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, for stealing horses and running a prostitution ring out of mobile tents that followed railroad workers and miners. These weren't legitimate businesses. These were illegal operations that exploited desperate women and defrauded customers. When Earp was brought before a judge, he posted bail and immediately fled the territory to avoid prosecution. For the next few years, he drifted through railroad camps and frontier towns working as muscle, a pimp, and a low-level enforcer for gambling operations. In Wichita, Kansas, he finally got hired as a lawman in 1875, but even then, his employment was controversial. He was fired after less than a year, likely for keeping fines he collected rather than turning them over to the city. The Earp family business model was simple. They'd move into a boomtown, get badges through political connections, then use their law enforcement positions to control vice, gambling, and prostitution while eliminating competition. In Tombstone, the Earps weren't cleaning up crime. They were monopolizing it. The OK Corral shootout wasn't about law and order. It was a gang war between the Earps and the cowboys over who controlled the criminal economy. After Tombstone, Wyatt drifted through mining camps and saloons, running card games and working as a hired gun. He didn't become a respectable hero until his final years when he moved to Los Angeles and started consulting on Western films, carefully crafting a sanitized version of his past. The legend of Wyatt Earp was built on selective memory and deliberate lies. Number 2, Native Americans were scalping because Europeans taught them. Pop culture taught you that scalping was a savage Native American practice that proved their brutality and justified their extermination. That narrative is backwards and deliberately misleading. Archaeological evidence shows that scalping existed in some indigenous cultures before European contact, but it was extremely rare, highly ritualized, and limited to specific warrior societies in specific regions. What turned it into widespread horror was European colonizers who weaponized it and turned human body parts into a cash commodity. The Dutch in New Netherland, modern-day New York, offered bounties for native scalps as early as the 1640s. They paid guilders for proof of kills, and scalps were the easiest proof to carry. The English colonies quickly followed the model. By the 1700s, colonial governments across British North America were paying substantial cash rewards for native scalps, men, women, children. It didn't matter. The going rate in some colonies was the equivalent of several months' wages for an average worker. Pennsylvania offered 134 Spanish dollars for an adult male scalp in 1764, a fortune at the time. Suddenly, scalping became profitable. Native tribes who'd never practiced it before started doing it, not because of some innate savagery, but because European settlers and soldiers were already hunting them for bounties and paying for scalps. It became a weapon in a genocidal economic system. Some tribes adopted scalping as psychological warfare against enemies who'd introduced the practice. Some of the worst scalp hunters were white frontiersmen who discovered they could make more money killing native people than trapping or farming. They'd raid peaceful villages, kill everyone, take the scalps, and collect government money. The practice became so common that some colonies had to create verification systems because hunters were submitting scalps from other animals or even from white people with dark hair. During the French and Indian War, both the French and British paid native allies for enemy scalps. During the American Revolution, the British continued the practice. By the 19th century, Mexico and later several U.S. states and territories were still offering scalp bounties. Some frontiersmen became wealthy doing nothing but scalp hunting. The myth that scalping was purely a native practice was propaganda designed to justify genocide by portraying indigenous people as inhuman savages. Number 3. The California Gold Rush was built on native genocide. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. Within 2 years, over 300,000 people flooded into the region. What's rarely taught is that California's native population went from about 150,000 in 1848 to less than 30,000 by 1870. That's not disease or displacement. That's systematic extermination. The California state government funded militias specifically to kill native people. Between 1850 and 1859, California spent over $1.7 million, a staggering sum at the time, paying armed groups to hunt down and murder indigenous men, women, and children. Miners would raid native villages, kill everyone, and take children to sell as slaves or indentured servants. This wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. Local newspapers advertised hunts. Townspeople would gather supplies for militia groups heading out to exterminate nearby tribes. Killings were so routine that they weren't even always reported as news unless the body count was particularly high. One militia bragged about killing over 100 Yuki people in a single day, including infants they threw into fires. The few survivors were forced onto reservations that were essentially concentration camps with no food, no medical care, and no legal protection. Those who tried to leave were hunted down and killed. Peter Hardeman Burnett, California's first governor, openly declared a war of extermination against native people, saying that the conflict would continue until the Indian race becomes extinct. This wasn't a side effect of the gold rush. It was policy. Number 4. Doc Holliday killed his first man over a card game argument about $2. Doc Holliday is remembered as Wyatt Earp's loyal friend and a deadly gunfighter with a code of honor. The real story is uglier and stupider. Holliday's first confirmed killing happened in Dallas, Texas, in 1875, and it was over a gambling dispute worth about $2 in today's money. Holliday was working as a dentist but gambling on the side because his tuberculosis made patients uncomfortable. During a card game in a saloon, another player accused him of cheating. The argument escalated. Holliday pulled a knife and stabbed the man. Some accounts say he shot him. Either way, the man died. Holliday fled Dallas to avoid arrest and never practiced dentistry seriously again. From that point on, he drifted through the West as a professional gambler, getting into fights, shootings, and stabbings in saloons from Colorado to Arizona. Most of his violence wasn't about defending the innocent or standing up for justice. It was drunken arguments, wounded pride, and ego. He was dying of tuberculosis and didn't care if he took people with him. His friendship with Wyatt Earp was less about loyalty and more about mutual benefit. Earp needed a fearless gunman who had nothing to lose. Holliday needed protection from the law. Their partnership worked because they were both ruthless and willing to use violence to get what they wanted. The Hollywood version of Doc Holliday as a tragic hero with a heart of gold is complete fiction. Number 5. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by effective slaves. Everyone learns that Chinese immigrants built the Transcontinental Railroad. What's left out is how. The Central Pacific Railroad recruited thousands of Chinese workers, mostly from Guangdong province, promising good wages and fair treatment. What they got was indentured servitude that looked a lot like slavery. Chinese workers were paid roughly half of what white workers earned for doing the most dangerous jobs. They were sent into tunnels to set dynamite charges, often dying in explosions or cave-ins. They were lowered in baskets down sheer cliffs to drill holes for explosives, and many fell to their deaths. During brutal Sierra Nevada winters, they lived in tunnels beneath the snow, and avalanches buried entire camps alive. When workers tried to strike for better pay and conditions in 1867, the railroad company cut off their food supply and threatened to withhold wages they'd already earned. The workers had no legal recourse. Chinese immigrants couldn't testify in court against white people under California law. They couldn't become citizens. They had no protection. Thousands died building the railroad. Exact numbers were never recorded because the companies didn't care to count. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves or left where they fell. When the railroad was completed in 1869 and the famous Golden Spike photograph was taken, not a single Chinese worker was allowed in the picture. The people who did the hardest and most dangerous work were erased from the official story. Number 6. Wild Bill Hickok was going blind and probably couldn't shoot straight anymore. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok built his reputation as one of the deadliest gunfighters in the West, with lightning-fast draws and perfect accuracy. By the time he arrived in Deadwood in 1876, he was going blind from trachoma and glaucoma, and there's evidence he could barely see past a few feet. Hickok spent his final months gambling because he couldn't do anything else. He wore tinted glasses to hide his failing eyes and sat with his back to walls because he couldn't see well enough to watch for threats. On August 2, 1876, the one time he sat with his back to the door, Jack McCall walked in and shot him in the back of the head. What's interesting is that Hickok's reputation was built on very few actual gunfights. Most of his supposed kills were exaggerations or outright fabrications spread by dime novels and his own storytelling. His most famous shootout against Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri, happened at close range, not the long-distance quick-draw duel the stories claimed. He likely killed fewer than 10 men in his entire life, and several of those were shot in the back or ambushed. The legend of Wild Bill Hickok as an unstoppable gunfighter with supernatural aim was marketing. He cultivated the image because it kept him employed and feared. But by the end, he was a broken-down alcoholic with failing eyesight who died because he got careless. The myth outlived the reality. Number 7. George Armstrong Custer was a war criminal who slaughtered peaceful villages. General George Armstrong Custer is often portrayed as a tragic hero who died bravely at Little Bighorn fighting savage Indians. The truth is that Custer was a glory-obsessed maniac who committed war crimes and got his entire command killed through arrogance and stupidity. Before Little Bighorn, Custer led the 7th Cavalry in attacks on peaceful native villages. In November 1868, he led a dawn raid on a Cheyenne village along the Washita River in present-day Oklahoma. The village was peaceful, camped under a white flag of truce. Custer ordered his troops to attack anyway. They killed over 100 people, mostly women, children, and elderly. Custer's men shot fleeing villagers in the back, burned lodges with people still inside, and slaughtered over 800 horses to ensure survivors couldn't escape or recover. Custer then abandoned part of his own command, leaving Major Joel Elliott and 18 men to be surrounded and killed because rescuing them would have slowed his retreat. He lied in his official report, calling the massacre a great victory and never mentioning that he left his own men to die. At Little Bighorn in 1876, Custer ignored orders, split his forces, refused reinforcements, and attacked a massive Lakota and Cheyenne encampment without reconnaissance. He thought he could win glory with a surprise attack. Instead, he led over 260 men to their deaths. Custer wasn't a hero. He was a war criminal whose recklessness finally caught up with him. Number 8, Billy the Kid wasn't a romantic outlaw. He was a cold-blooded murderer. Billy the Kid is remembered as a charming young outlaw, a Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich. The reality is that William Bonney was a killer who murdered at least 8 people, possibly more, and showed no remorse. Billy's first confirmed kill was in 1877 when he shot and killed a man named Frank Cahill during an argument in a saloon. He was 17 years old. He fled to New Mexico and fell in with a gang of cattle rustlers and hired guns. During the Lincoln County War, he killed at least 3 more men, sometimes in fair fights, sometimes by ambush. What gets left out of the legend is that Billy killed for money. He was a hired gun who worked for whoever paid him. When his employer, John Tunstall, was murdered, Billy swore revenge, but it wasn't about loyalty or justice. It was about losing his paycheck. He joined the regulators and went on a killing spree, murdering anyone connected to the rival faction. After he was captured and sentenced to hang in 1881, he killed 2 deputies while escaping, James Bell and Bob Olinger. Bell was shot in the back while running away. Billy showed no mercy. Sheriff Pat Garrett hunted him down and shot him dead in July 1881. Billy was 21 years old and had spent his entire adult life as a killer. The romantic legend came later, built by dime novels that turned a sociopathic gunman into a tragic hero. Number 9. Jesse James robbed his first bank while wearing a KKK hood. Jesse James is treated as an American folk hero, a gentleman bandit who fought against corrupt railroads and banks. Songs have been written about him. Movies have romanticized him. He's portrayed as a rebel with a code, a Robin Hood of the frontier. That's propaganda built on lost cause mythology. The real Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla terrorist during the Civil War who rode with Bloody Bill Anderson's gang, one of the most brutal irregular units in American history. They murdered Union soldiers, tortured prisoners, mutilated bodies, and terrorized civilians in Missouri and Kansas. After the war ended in 1865, Jesse and his brother Frank refused to accept defeat or rejoin civilian society. Their first bank robbery happened in February 1866 in Liberty, Missouri. Jesse and his gang, many of them former Confederate guerrillas, wore hoods during the robbery, and contemporary accounts suggest these were Ku Klux Klan hoods or similar disguises. They robbed the Clay County Savings Association, stealing over $60,000 in cash and bonds, an enormous sum at the time. During their escape, they encountered a college student named George Wymore who was just walking down the street, completely uninvolved. They shot him dead in the street. Some accounts say they shot him for fun. Others say it was to create panic. Either way, they murdered an innocent teenager for no reason other than cruelty or tactical advantage. For the next 16 years, the James gang robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches across the Midwest. They killed at least a dozen people, many of them innocent bystanders, train workers, or lawmen just doing their jobs. Jesse cultivated a Robin Hood image by writing letters to newspapers claiming he only stole from Yankees and railroads. But the truth is he robbed anyone with money and killed anyone who got in his way. He was finally killed in 1882 by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang who shot him in the back for reward money. Jesse's death turned him into a martyr. Songs were written, stories were told, and the truth was buried under layers of lost cause mythology that portrayed Confederate outlaws as noble rebels. Jesse James wasn't a hero. He was a terrorist and a murderer who got rich off violence. Number 10. Most famous gunfights never happened the way the stories claim. Hollywood taught you that Old West gunfights were formal duels at high noon on empty streets with 2 men facing each other. Almost none of that is true. Real gunfights were ambushes, drunken brawls, or executions. The OK Corral shootout lasted about 30 seconds and happened in an alley, not a wide street. Most of the men involved were standing less than 6 feet apart. It wasn't a duel. It was a close-range brawl where both sides opened fire simultaneously. 3 men died and several were wounded, but it was chaos, not a choreographed showdown. Wild Bill Hickok's famous duel with Davis Tutt in 1865 happened at about 75 yards, which sounds impressive until you realize both men were using rifles, not pistols, and they stood still taking careful aim. It wasn't a quick draw. It was 2 guys shooting at each other like it was target practice. Most famous gunfighters didn't die in fair fights. Wild Bill was shot in the back. Jesse James was shot in the back. Billy the Kid was shot in the dark by a sheriff who ambushed him. John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed over 40 men, was shot in the back while playing dice. The romantic idea of the fair fight quick draw duel was invented by dime novels and later by Hollywood. Real gunfights were fast, brutal, and usually decided by whoever shot first, often from behind. Number 11. Calamity Jane was an alcoholic fantasist who made up most of her own legend. Martha Jane Canary, known as Calamity Jane, is remembered as a sharpshooter, a scout, and a Wild West heroine who rode with Wild Bill Hickok. Almost everything famous about her is a lie she told while drunk. Jane was a frontierswoman who worked as a cook, a prostitute, and a camp follower. She drank heavily and told elaborate stories about scouting for the army, fighting Indians, and being Wild Bill Hickok's lover. There's no evidence she ever worked as an army scout. She was never a sharpshooter, and Wild Bill Hickok barely knew her and openly avoided her because she was drunk and annoying. After Hickok was killed, Jane started claiming they were secretly married or in love, which gave her a connection to a famous name. She spent the rest of her life drunk in saloons, telling increasingly wild stories to anyone who'd buy her a drink. In her final years, she traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, but even they eventually fired her for being too drunk to perform. She died in 1903, broke and alcoholic, and was buried next to Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood because she'd spent decades claiming they belonged together. Her entire legend was built on lies, alcohol, and the fact that people wanted to believe the frontier had women as wild as the men. The real Calamity Jane was a tragic figure who invented a fantasy life to escape her miserable reality. Number 12. The Pony Express was a financial disaster that lasted 18 months. The Pony Express is one of the most romanticized symbols of the Old West, brave riders racing across dangerous territory to deliver mail. In reality, it was a failed business that barely lasted a year and a half and never made a profit. The Pony Express operated from April 1860 to October 1861. It was founded to deliver mail faster between Missouri and California, using a relay system of riders changing horses every 10 to 15 miles. It was incredibly expensive to run, required hundreds of horses, dozens of stations, and riders willing to risk their lives for low pay. The service charged $5 per half ounce of mail, a massive amount of money at the time, and still lost money on every delivery. The completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph in October 1861 made the Pony Express obsolete overnight. You could send a message across the country in minutes instead of days. The company collapsed, filed for bankruptcy, and disappeared. The legend of the Pony Express was created years later by Buffalo Bill Cody, who claimed to have been a rider, though there's little evidence he actually was. Dime novels and later Hollywood turned it into a symbol of frontier courage, but the truth is it was a commercial failure that exists in history mostly because it failed so spectacularly that people remembered it. Number 13. Most cowboys were broke, exploited workers, not heroic gunslingers. Hollywood cowboys are independent, tough, and free. Real cowboys were underpaid laborers doing brutal work for rich ranchers who treated them like dirt. A cowboy in the 1870s and 1880s earned about $30 to $40 a month, roughly $900 in today's money. They worked 14 to 18-hour days, slept on the ground, ate terrible food, and faced constant danger from weather, animals, and accidents. Most never owned the land they worked. They were hired hands with no job security. About a third of all cowboys were black or Mexican, facts that Hollywood erased for decades. After the Civil War, many formerly enslaved men went west and became cowboys because it was one of the few jobs available. They faced racism, lower pay than white cowboys, and were often excluded from the heroic cowboy mythology that developed later. Cowboys didn't carry guns everywhere. Most ranchers banned guns on cattle drives because armed workers might start shooting each other over arguments. When cowboys did carry guns, it was for snakes and injured animals, not for duels. The image of the gun-toting cowboy was largely invented by Wild West shows and movies. Real cowboys were workers, and they were exploited, underpaid, and forgotten by history until Hollywood turned them into symbols of American freedom they never actually had. Number 14. Fort Laramie Treaty was ignored before the ink dried. In 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. The treaty guaranteed the Black Hills of South Dakota to the Lakota forever and promised that the U.S. would prevent white settlers from entering the territory. The government broke the treaty almost immediately. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, thousands of miners flooded into the region. The U.S. Army was supposed to keep them out under the treaty. Instead, the Army protected the miners and helped them set up camps. George Armstrong Custer himself led the expedition that confirmed the gold deposits and then publicized it to encourage settlement. The Lakota protested. They'd been promised the land in perpetuity, and now it was being invaded. The government's response was to demand the Lakota sell the Black Hills. When they refused, the government declared them hostile and sent the army to force them onto reservations. This led directly to the Great Sioux War of 1876, which included the Battle of Little Bighorn. Even after the Lakota won that battle, the U.S. government simply took the Black Hills anyway, forcing new agreements at gunpoint. In 1980, over a century later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded compensation. The Lakota refused the money, saying the land was never for sale. To this day, the Black Hills remain stolen land, and the Fort Laramie Treaty stands as proof that the U.S. government's word meant nothing. Number 15. Tombstone was controlled by a corrupt political machine, not cleaned up by lawmen. The town of Tombstone, Arizona, is famous as the place where Wyatt Earp and his brothers brought law and order. That's backwards. Tombstone was controlled by a corrupt political and business machine, and the Earps were part of it. The town was run by a coalition of mine owners, saloon operators, and politicians who controlled everything from elections to law enforcement. The Earps arrived in Tombstone not to fight crime, but to get rich. Wyatt worked as a shotgun guard for Wells Fargo and ran gambling operations. His brothers Virgil and Morgan held law enforcement positions, but they used their badges to shake down rival gamblers and protect their own businesses. The so-called cowboys, the faction the Earps fought against, were also criminals, but they represented rural ranchers and outlaws who didn't want to be controlled by the Tombstone business elite. The OK Corral shootout wasn't law versus outlaws. It was one criminal faction fighting another for control of the town's economy. After the shootout, the violence escalated. Morgan Earp was assassinated. Virgil was ambushed and crippled. Wyatt launched his vendetta ride, hunting down and killing men he blamed, often without evidence. None of this was legal. Wyatt fled Arizona to avoid murder charges and never returned. Tombstone continued to be violent and corrupt long after the Earps left. The town's real cleanup came from economic collapse when the mines flooded and people left. Number 16. The Wild West wasn't actually that wild compared to modern America. This might shock you, but despite all the violence and lawlessness we've talked about, The actual homicide rate in most Old West towns was lower than many modern American cities. Historians have studied records from places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood, and found that murders were rarer than the legends suggest. Dodge City, famous as one of the wildest towns, averaged about 1.5 homicides per year during its peak cowboy era in the 1870s. Tombstone, during its most violent years in the early 1880s, had about 5 murders per year in a town of several thousand people. Compare that to modern cities where dozens or hundreds of murders happen annually. The difference is perception and mythology. A single dramatic shootout in an Old West town would be talked about for years and written about in newspapers across the country. It became legend. But statistically, you were safer walking the streets of Dodge City in 1878 than walking through many modern American cities today. Why does this matter? Because the myth of the Wild West as a place of constant violence was useful propaganda. It justified military occupation of indigenous lands, it excused brutal law enforcement, and it created a narrative that white settlers were taming savage chaos. The truth is more complicated. The West was violent, but much of that violence was systemic, organized, and directed by governments and corporations against native people, workers, and anyone who threatened profits. Number 17. Bat Masterson was a gambler and con artist who bought his reputation. Bat Masterson is remembered as one of the great lawmen of the Old West, a tough but fair marshal who cleaned up dangerous towns. The real Bartholomew Masterson was primarily a professional gambler and saloon owner who held law enforcement jobs only when it benefited his gambling interests. Masterson worked as a lawman in Dodge City and other Kansas towns during the 1870s and early 1880s, but his main income came from running card games and operating saloons. He used his badge to protect his businesses and intimidate competition. When he wasn't working as a lawman, he traveled as a gambler and con man, running rigged card games and dice games across the frontier. His reputation as a deadly gunfighter was mostly fabricated. Masterson was involved in very few actual shootouts, and in most of them, he wasn't the one doing the shooting. He survived the frontier not through fast draws but through smart politics, making the right friends, and knowing when to leave town before trouble caught up with him. In his later years, Masterson moved to New York City and reinvented himself as a sports writer and boxing promoter. He spent his final decades writing newspaper columns where he told exaggerated stories about his frontier days, carefully crafting the legend of Bat Masterson, the fearless lawman. He died in 1921 at his desk writing a column, remembered as a hero even though his real career was built on gambling, manipulation, and self-promotion. Number 18. The homestead system was designed to steal native land and give it to white settlers for free. The Homestead Act of 1862 is taught in schools as a generous program that gave Americans the opportunity to own land and build a better life. What's left out is that the land being given away was stolen from native nations through violence, broken treaties, and forced removal. The government offered 160 acres of free land to anyone who would settle it for 5 years. Sounds generous until you realize that land belonged to someone else. The Homestead Act accelerated the theft of over 270 million acres of indigenous land. Settlers moved in with government and military backing, displacing or killing native people who'd lived there for generations. The act also discriminated heavily. Women could only claim land if they were single or widowed. Black Americans were technically eligible after the Civil War, but racist violence and discriminatory practices made it nearly impossible for them to file claims or keep the land they settled. Most homesteaders were white, and many failed because 160 acres wasn't enough to sustain a farm in dry western climates. The real winners were railroads and speculators. Railroad companies received millions of acres for free as incentives to build tracks, then sold that land at huge profits. Wealthy speculators filed fraudulent claims, hired people to pretend to settle land, then took ownership and resold it. The Homestead Act was sold as opportunity for ordinary people, but it was really a massive land giveaway to corporations and white settlers built on genocide. Number 19. Most frontier towns had strict gun control laws. This will shock modern Americans who think the Old West was a place where everyone carried guns everywhere. Most frontier towns had strict gun ordinances that required visitors to check their firearms with the sheriff or marshal when they entered town limits. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, and other famous towns all had laws banning carrying firearms within city limits. You could own a gun, but you couldn't walk around town wearing it. Visitors were required to leave their guns at the sheriff's office, a hotel, or a livery stable. Violators were fined or arrested. Why? Because armed drunks in crowded saloons led to shootings over stupid arguments. Town leaders and business owners wanted stability and commerce, not constant violence. The gunfight mythology came later, but the reality was that frontier towns tried hard to control guns because they knew armed populations were dangerous. The OK Corral shootout happened partly because the cowboys refused to disarm when entering Tombstone, violating the town's gun ordinance. The Earps confronted them to enforce the law, though of course the Earps themselves were armed because they were lawmen. The irony is that the most famous gunfight in Old West history happened over gun control. Number 20. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was racist propaganda disguised as entertainment. William Buffalo Bill Cody created his Wild West show in 1883 and toured the United States and Europe for over 30 years. The show featured reenactments of frontier battles, trick shooting, displays of horsemanship, and performances by cowboys, Native Americans, and sharpshooters like Annie Oakley. It was hugely popular, seen by millions of people across 2 continents, and shaped how entire generations understood the American West. It was also carefully crafted racist propaganda that justified genocide and turned mass murder into family entertainment. The show portrayed white settlers and the U.S. Army as heroes bringing civilization and progress to a savage wilderness. Native performers, including famous leaders like Sitting Bull and warriors who'd fought at Little Bighorn, were hired to play themselves in scripted reenactments where they always lost. Battles were staged to show white heroes defeating Native warriors in glorious combat, completely erasing the reality of massacres, broken treaties, starvation campaigns, and systematic genocide. The show featured reenactments of Custer's last stand, with Cody himself sometimes playing Custer, turning a military disaster caused by arrogance and racism into a heroic tragedy. They staged attacks on settler cabins and wagon trains, with Native performers playing savage raiders who were always defeated by brave white frontiersmen. European audiences, who knew nothing about actual American history, left believing they'd witnessed authentic frontier life when really they'd watched a propaganda performance. Sitting Bull joined the show briefly in 1885, not because he agreed with its message but because he needed money. His people were starving on reservations. He traveled with the show through the U.S. and Europe, performing for crowds who saw him as a curiosity, a tamed savage. Reports say he was deeply uncomfortable with how the show portrayed his people, but he had no other options. Buffalo Bill himself was complicit in the violence he later turned into entertainment. He worked as an Army scout and participated in campaigns against Native nations. He killed buffalo by the thousands to starve Plains tribes who depended on them. Then he turned around and sold the story of the frontier as heroic adventure, making millions, while the people he helped destroy were dying on reservations. Number 21. The legend of the cowboy was invented to sell cigarettes and movies. The cowboy as a cultural icon, the rugged individualist with a code of honor, didn't exist during the actual Old West. It was invented in the early 20th century by advertisers and Hollywood studios. In the 1920s and 1930s, cigarette companies started using cowboy imagery to sell tobacco. The Marlboro Man didn't appear until 1954, but earlier campaigns associated smoking with rugged frontier masculinity. Meanwhile, Hollywood was cranking out Western films that portrayed cowboys as heroes. Stars like Tom Mix, John Wayne, and later Clint Eastwood became symbols of American manhood. These portrayals had almost nothing to do with reality. Real cowboys were workers. Hollywood cowboys were fantasy projections of what white America wanted to believe about itself. Tough, independent, moral, and always winning. The cowboy myth was useful during the Cold War as a symbol of American superiority over Soviet collectivism. By the 1950s, Westerns dominated television and film. Kids grew up playing cowboys and Indians, internalizing the idea that westward expansion was heroic and that native people were obstacles to progress. The cowboy became a political symbol used to justify everything from military intervention to deregulation. It's one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history, turning exploited workers into symbols of freedom and genocide, into a heroic origin story. Number 22. Many famous outlaws were never caught because lawmen were incompetent or corrupt. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid famously escaped to South America and were never confirmed captured or killed by U.S. authorities. Billy the Kid evaded capture for years despite being one of the most wanted men in New Mexico. Black Bart robbed 28 stagecoaches and was only caught because of a laundry mark on a handkerchief. Why were so many outlaws able to operate for years? Because law enforcement in the Old West was inconsistent, underfunded, and often corrupt. Sheriffs were elected locally and often had financial ties to criminals. Marshals had huge territories to cover with no communication systems. Outlaws could cross state or territorial lines and be almost impossible to track. Many lawmen were former outlaws themselves or had criminal connections. Some sheriffs took bribes to look the other way. Others simply didn't care enough to pursue criminals unless there was significant reward money. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, a private corporation, was often more effective at catching outlaws than government lawmen, which tells you how dysfunctional public law enforcement was. The mythology of relentless frontier justice, the idea that outlaws always got caught and faced consequences, is mostly fiction. Many outlaws lived long lives, retired quietly, and died of old age. The law was slow, corrupt, and easily avoided if you were smart and had money. Number 23. The closing of the frontier didn't end expansion. It went global. In 1890, the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. But American expansionism didn't stop. It just changed targets. Within a decade, the United States was invading and occupying territories overseas using the same justifications that had been used to conquer the West. The Spanish-American War in 1898 resulted in the U.S. taking control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Philippine-American War that followed killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, many of them civilians, using tactics developed fighting Native Americans. General Jacob Smith, who'd fought in the Indian Wars, ordered his troops to turn the Philippine island of Samar into a howling wilderness and to kill everyone over the age of 10. The same officers, the same strategies, and the same racist rhetoric that justified westward expansion were exported globally. Indigenous people became Filipino, Haitians, Nicaraguans. Manifest destiny became American interventionism. The frontier mentality, the belief that American expansion was inevitable and righteous, never died. It just found new territories to conquer. Today, you can still see the legacy of the Old West in American foreign policy, in corporate exploitation, in the worship of rugged individualism that ignores systemic inequality, and in the myths we tell ourselves about who we are and how we got here. The frontier never closed. It just learned to speak the language of democracy and free markets while doing the same violence it always did. If you made it this far, you're starting to see how deep the lies go. Everything you were taught about the Old West was carefully constructed mythology designed to make genocide, theft, and exploitation look like heroic destiny. The men celebrated as legends were often killers, thieves, and con artists. The systems they built were corrupt and brutal, and the myths we still believe were created by the same people who profited from the violence. Here's the reality nobody wants to admit. The Old West wasn't a romantic adventure where good triumphed over evil. It was a corporate land grab disguised as freedom. It was ethnic cleansing disguised as civilization. It was exploitation disguised as opportunity. And every myth, every hero, every legend was carefully designed to make you forget that. So what do you do with this information? You stop believing the stories. You question who benefits from the myths. You recognize that the same systems built during the Old West, the worship of property over people, the belief that might makes right, the idea that some lives matter less than others, are still running the show today. The frontier never ended. It just got better at hiding. Drop a comment and tell me which forbidden secret shocked you the most. Hit like if you want more buried history they don't teach in schools. Subscribe because next week we're exposing even darker truths they tried to erase. And remember, history is written by the winners, but the truth is written in the bodies they left behind.